Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Western Spirit. So, today we have someone who is really an amazing person. So, today with us, we have Nova Peris. Nova is a true Australian, and I think just a trailblazer, just not only for Australia. She was the first Indigenous Australian to win an Olympic gold medal and later made history again as the first Indigenous woman selected to Australia's federal parliament. Nova is really an amazing person, and her life story, which we'll maybe get into at the end of our conversation, is something that I think all my viewers and listeners will find fascinating. So, Nova, it's such a pleasure to speak with you finally.
Yes, thank you very
Totally
much for having
likewise.
me
And
on.
I wanted to just
I'm
start with
thrilled
you. We just
to be
had
chatting
the
to you
election
today.
in Australia on Saturday. Today we're Wednesday, so it's not that long ago. How do you look at the choice that Australians made? Where is your country heading?
Well, the
Hmm.
Albanese Labor government were first elected 3 years ago, and it's almost a very, very, very rare, I guess, thing for a first term government to be not re elected. However, in saying that, it has been a bit of an awful campaign. Well, not only just awful campaign, it's there's been so much
Yes.
disarray, if I can say, in this country, and the Middle East conflict has played a big part in that, to the weekly protests, etc., etc. But I, as a former Labor senator and the first Aboriginal woman in the Australian Parliament for Labor, and also first woman in the Australian Parliament, I'm absolutely thrilled that Labor have been re-elected, and
Yes.
it's an overwhelming majority, so they do not have to rely on other political parties to be able to get things through. So that is a great thing. And Labor does have some wonderful policies for the Australian people. Hence my daughter, who's just graduated as a nurse, Ariel, and when she went to vote on Saturday, I said, "Who are you voting?" She goes, "Of course, Labor, Mum." And I said, "Who's the person you're voting for?" She said, "Mum, all I know is that Labor wiping 20% off her university fees." So there was something in this budget for everyone. So I'm very pleased that Labor have gotten up, and they're not reliant upon the
I was gonna
rotten
ask you
Greens,
about that
and I will
specifically,
say that
but
gladly.
okay,
I was
continue, and then
part
we'll
of the
ask about it.
campaign. Yeah. Yes. So we've had great news for Australian politics that the Greens leader Adam
Hmm.
Bant has lost his seat, which he held for a very, very long time.
Can
So
I ask you something a little bit maybe
he's been
uncomfortable
ousted,
about what
which
you
is
just
great
said?
news
Just
for Australian
I'm in a lot
politics.
of groups. I didn't of Australian Jews. I did a big expose in our
Mm.
magazine of the newspaper I work with about the rise in anti-Semitism since October 7th. All of the groups that I'm in are very, let's say, 99%, maybe it's they're all very worried about this they did not want the new government to win. um uh, why do you think that is?
From someone who's no longer in politics, I'm a free agent. I can and go and do the things and say whatever I want. I have that agency to be able to do that. I think where a lot of Jewish people have felt let down is because what we saw play out on the shores here at the Sydney Opera House on the 9th of October was a disgraceful display. Actually, I think it was on the 8th, clicking over to the 9th of October. You know, and I say this with a heavy heart. The blood hadn't even dried from the October 7 massacre, and the Opera House was going to be lit up with the Israeli flag. And there were countless thugs and mobs that, in their hundreds, went to the Opera House and they
F the
were
Jews, all
chanting,
these kind of things.
"Where's the Jews?" You know, F the Jews. They claim to say we didn't say gas the Jews, but that's something, you know, even with to say, you and I both know the history of the Holocaust, and them saying where's the Jews to me is worse. And the lack of condemning of that which took place, and if people had been arrested and there were consequences of that, I believe there would not have been the rise of anti-Semitism, because what it did, it validated people being able to get away with bad behaviour. Chris Minns, who's the Labor Premier for New South Wales, he has actually been really staunch with the support of the Jewish people. But I think where the Jewish people here in Australia have been really let down is that there's been lack of consequences for these actions. And I think where Labor, because the hard thing is we only have 3-year terms, Ariel, in the Australian Parliament. It's not like you have 4 or 5 years, you get elected, then you stink your teeth into policy and you get things done. It's almost like you get elected, then you're finding your feet, and then, oh my gosh, you 1 year to go and you go back into campaign mode. So, you know, here in Australia, we have 150,000 Jewish people. And you have nearly 900,000, just under 1 million Muslim people here in this country. So to me, Labor, and there were a lot of Labor seats which were heavy with Muslim voters. And what I saw is when an incident happened, for example, those young 11 Jews boys
They
that
weren't
were
Jewish, by the way.
children that were
They were
murdered
Druze.
last year in the soccer
Druze.
field.
Ah, okay.
No, Druze. Yes, sorry, I did say Druze. But when they were innocently murdered, you know, there were statements that were put out, but instead of just saying this is it's terrorist, it's a terrorist attack, and you know, we stand with the Jewish, the families, the Druze people, the Israeli people. It then had to go in and talk about the war in Gaza. Do you know what I mean? And so I felt that, this is just my opinion, observation, was sometimes seen to be appeasing to both, and that's politics at times, and it can be seen. And you know, we have Joshua Burns, who's a Labor MP, and of course our Attorney General Mark Dreyfus, who is a Jewish man, both in the Labor Party, and I think, you know, there were some Jewish people that felt left down. But I know for myself, I've been in Parliament. I'm a former senator. You are at times bound by your party's political position. But hand on my heart, I truly believe, because of the overwhelming victory, and I know that Labor for many, many, many decades have been an ally of Israel. And I think that that's where they need to, you know, they draw a hard line in standing with Ukraine. And that's what we need to see now happen in support, knowing that everyone's been re-elected. It's been an overwhelming re-election. And me as an Aboriginal woman, who my people still face overwhelming racism in this country, I know who have stood with my people, and it's been the Jewish people. And they've stood with my people for close to a whole century, you know, going way back over the years. And of course, we cannot forget Sir John Monash, who was a Jewish man who was the general of the Australian Defence Force in World War One. And you know, he is our greatest ever war general, and he was a Jewish Australian. And so for me, in my position, and I'm also the co-patron of Labor for Israel with the former Premier Daniel Andrews of Victoria. So we are the co-patrons, and my job is to continue to put the truth out there, to continue to tell the Jewish story, and to do my bit in getting rid of anti-Semitism in this country, because I can tell you now, I've cried many a times when I go to synagogues and I go to schools, Jewish schools, and I see the sadness and the pain in the eyes of the Jewish elderly people, but also the young Jewish members of this country. And everyone should have.
And I would just say that just to, there's two things. Number one is the anti-Semitism in Australia, which has, I, I assume you agree with me, has been going through the roof since that incident. We've spoken to people of synagogues that were firebombed, and one of the leaders, his name evades me, of the Australian Jewish community, spoke to me about his own house being threatened with bomb threats and spray painted very like derogatory things on schools, and they feel sort of abandoned by the rest of Australia. A lot of Jews feel like people aren't standing up, which is why someone like you, they feel so close to you. You, for example, spoke about synagogues. I know you've been speaking at synagogues. You're being invited to speak with large Jewish communities. So I think that's why people are so drawn to your bravery on this issue.
I think it's interesting, like all my life, like I'll go back and talk a bit of history, because my mother was taken off her mother when she was 8 years old. So she was a member of the stolen generation. And my grandmother was also a member of the stolen generation. So for the listeners who don't know, the stolen generation was an act of the government, states and state government here, which came about in the late 1800s. So it gave the governments the right to remove Aboriginal children of their parents if they had an ounce of white blood in them. So the idea was to actually breed us out as a race of people. So my grandmother, and it's, when they were put into the missions, I know the history of the atrocities of the concentration camps, but the mission sites, they've been, federal reports and royal commissions into what actually happened and the atrocities. And my mum was sent to a Catholic mission, and the Catholic dice came out and apologised a number of years ago. But this was 52 years after the mission closure, and the Catholic dice here apologised for the atrocities that these young children endured. And so when I know, like the Holocaust survivors who came out to Australia for their freedoms, they internalised a lot of pain, like my mother internalised a lot of pain, like my grandparents, because you were treated inhumanely. You were treated not as a citizen that ever mattered. It was people's duties, the government, to erase us. And what happened to the Jewish people? People wanted to erase the Jewish people. So I have a lot of empathy for the Jewish people, because my own people suffered that. And what I feel, and this is the history and why me standing with the Jewish community is so steadfast, is because in 1938 there was an Aboriginal man called William Cooper, and William Cooper's son, or a family member, also fought in World War I, and they had died overseas. So this William Cooper was in his 70s, and on the 8th or 6th of December 1938, during Crystal Night, William Cooper wrote a letter to the German embassy here in Australia, and that letter, it was a petition to say how disgusted he was in the treatment of the Jewish people, and he demanded that what was happening to the Jewish people stop. Now, here was an Aboriginal man that was subjected to some of the most horrific cruelty himself and how we were treated as Aboriginal people, yet he stood for an oppressed people, and he probably had never met a Jewish person, but he understood war, but he heard about what was happening to the Jewish people. So I think that the Jewish people, and I know that the Jewish people came out here on the First Fleet in 1788, and then they came as free settlers in the 1800s, and then they came after World War One, and then World War Two, and then many Jews have come out here, so much so we have 150,000 Jewish people. But the Jewish people have never forgotten the bravery of this Aboriginal man. And in Jerusalem, in the museum, at the Holocaust Museum, there's actually a tribute to William Cooper. So I know how well the Jewish people actually honour. So in my heart, the Jewish people have always been so good to Aboriginal people because they've never forgotten what William Cooper did for them. The fact that he did that has never left their side, and they honour that every year. And so for me, I guess my mother on the mission and my grandparents, they never had a voice. They weren't allowed. Their voices were suppressed. And so for me, when I was born into freedom and me playing sports, I could go to school. I could play sports as a free person. So I developed and made my own platform. I created my own pathway. And whilst I was, I guess conquering global sports, you could say that, I'm Olympic gold medalist and all the rest of it, it allowed me to see the world freely. It gave me detachment from wanting to have an ego because I've achieved at the highest level. So for me, truth has always mattered because my mum's truth was denied. And there was this great man, Ariel, his name was Ron Caston. And Ron Caston dedicated 40 years of his life in litigating for Aboriginal people's land rights, Aboriginal people's human rights, and a lot of lawyers have dedicated their lives for the justice of Aboriginal people. And so when this country was colonized in 1788, Arthur Phillip planted the Union Jack and he declared Australia terra nullius, meaning land belonging to no one. And so we aren't even written in the constitution of this country. And it took up until 1967 a referendum where the Australian people voted to count us as citizens of this country. And it also gave the federal government the legal right to make laws for us as Aboriginal people. But it was in 1982, and this Ron Caston, it took 10 years in the High Court of Australia. So in 1992, on the 2nd of June or 3rd of June 1992, he was victorious in getting rid of the notion of terra nullius, and it was called the Mabo case, where Eddie Mabo was a Torres Strait Islander, and it took him and a number of Torres Strait Islanders. And what the Mabo case did with Ron Caston, the Jewish man fighting, it was now recognised in common law of this country that the land and our connection to land has existed for some 60,000 years. So for me, knowing all of this history and all of the Jewish lawyers that have fought in pockets of land rights, I have never forgotten that. So I've a lot of Jewish friends, and when October 7 happened, the week later, there was a failed referendum to put us as First People in the nation's constitution, and to give us a voice in the Australian Parliament. The voice was just an advisory, had no veto powers. And there was all this propaganda, lies in the media, and you would be very familiar with that. And 60% of the country turned its back on us and voted no. So not only were the Jewish people hurting after October 7, exactly 1 week later, me as an Aboriginal person, I cried and cried for weeks. So did my parents. And so about 2 or 3 weeks later, when no one was standing up for Jewish people, I had a number of my friends saying, Nova, where are our friends? And I said to him and Sonny, I said, let me get my head around, because I'd never been to Israel, I'd never been to the Middle East. So I needed to understand what was going on. And so the more I understood, I wrote articles. And then I, of course, went to Israel in March of last year. So I went there to learn your history, to see your history, to smell your history, to feel your history. And I got your history. So for me to bring that truth back.
Can I ask you, as an Aboriginal person, you are the, I guess, the original, in the modern times, the original colonized people. We can, I think, anyone would agree with that, and even people who are patriots in Australia, and the original, like in America where I grew up, in the original sin is slavery, and even American patriots all recognize it. So I don't think it's controversial to say that, and yet we keep on hearing Israel is settler colonialism and all these protests where Israel is the colonizers, the Palestinians are the colonized. We're the white, I guess, bad person because everyone's white is bad. There's no distinction. First of all, most Israelis aren't white. My wife is Iraqi and Persian, so it's just a very weird dynamic. But how, as you, as someone who's an Aboriginal person who does understand what it means to be colonized, look at these claims?
Well, I just think that they're outrageous. And having gone to Israel myself, you hear all these woke idiots, I'll call them woke idiots on the street, saying, calling it's Israel's an apartheid state. It's a genocide, and chanting from the river to the sea. And when you ask a lot of these people, they don't even know what river and what sea. But the reality is these people chanting this, what they're wanting to do is to get rid of the whole state of Israel. That's what they're chanting for, right? There's no ifs and buts about it. So my
10. We
view
passed
is
10 this year. 10.
there's, what is there,
Yeah,
nine and a
exactly.
half million people in Israel? 10, 10 million people, and 2 million of those are Arab Israelis. That they coexist on, what is it, the Israeli Airlines, Air, Al. You're sitting there, and the menu is written in Hebrew, it's written in Arabic, and it's written in English. Everything you get into you know, the airport, everything's written in Hebrew. The street signs, everything. So that tells you it's not an apartheid state, first and foremost. And then you go there, and then you go and meet the Arabs in Tel Aviv, and going back from Masada, you stop in all these places. There are Arabs working everywhere, and they're serving you, and you talk to them. And I spoke to many of them. What do they want? Do they love Israel? Of course they love Israel. They love it because it's a democracy, and I went into the Knesset, and you speak to an array of politicians that Israel, there's no apartheid. And then you go to the wall, the Western Wall, and you see these beautiful Israeli soldiers, the women. And I met these two beautiful women. One was a Yemen Jew and the other one was an Ethiopian Jew. And this is what gets me. People chanting all of this is utter rubbish. And I've written many opinion op-eds going back to the history. And I grew up as a Catholic, so I know that Jesus was a Jewish man. On top of the cross is INRI, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jew. Even my mother knows that. We all know that. But if you go back to the history, and my husband's he's a white fella. He came on his family came on the first fleet and all the rest of it. But for him, he's an atheist. He said, but he knew elements of the Bible and heard the stories, he said, I've never felt more spiritual apart from coming out to my country in Kakadu. And he said, even for me, it brought the Bible to life, and when you look at where you've got the Western Wall, then you can see the dome, and then you had the church behind me. You've got all three faiths coexisting, and I'll never forget. I did a video piece, and I'm standing there, and it was during Ramadan for the Muslims, and you could hear their their prayer, a call to prayer. And I'm doing this cross, and people are saying, "Stop lying, Nova. They don't exist. This is propaganda." And I'm like, you people are just idiots. And it for me, it's like going to Israel, just see, like, you can touch this temple or this over here, and that's 2,500 years old, and you see all this archaeological evidence, and going to the Masada and knowing the history of Masada and the ruins there. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. So I just think there are so many idiots, and all these people chanting on the streets. They are just all about anarchy. They're about creating, they're just serial protesters. They don't know what they're protesting about, and they've caused division in this country. So it is my hope that the Albanese government can curb all of this and bring social cohesion, and to not forget the contribution that the Jewish people have made to this country, because there's been over 8,000 Jewish people that have fought in our armed force defenses, and some 600 have died for our freedoms. And that for me is something that is just so close to my heart, because my great grandfather also fought in World War II. He fought in Syria, Lebanon. He came back to Australia because where I live here in Darwin was bombed on 19th of February 1942, and we endured 2 years of air raids from the Japanese. And then I've done the Kokoda campaign twice. And I just got back because we had our Anzac Day on the 25th of April. And you had your Yom Hazikaron, which I spoke at the Tuareg, yes, at the Tuareg Synagogue. And I actually spoke about how in the Kokoda campaign, in this graveyard of some 4,000 graves, it's a beautiful graveyard, and there's some 700 soldiers, and it just says, "A soldier of the war, unknown but known to God." And that's the reality of people who've given their lives for our freedoms. But in there is 6 Star of Davids, Magen Davids, on the Commonwealth, what do you call it, the tombstone. And I'll never forget this one young boy. His name was Joseph Rovkin. And the history was, he came out from Poland when he was 2 years old. Both of his parents fought in the for Russia, but they endured a lot of anti-Semitism. So they came out to Australia for a better life. And when this Joseph Rovkin was 15 years old, he changed his name to Joseph Rawkin so he could hide his Jewish identity. And he lied about his age, and he went to war at the age of 16, and 4 weeks into battle, he died. So this is what people need to remember when I say the Jewish contribution to this country. You build things up, you honor life, you just want freedom. And this young family came out to Australia in search of freedom, only to lose their
Also, I
son
wanted to,
fighting for this
after that,
country.
I'm a little bit speechless because it is very touching. Um, I wanted to just say that you don't even have to respond. That the fact that it's like obvious to people that the 900,000 plus Muslim voters, you said, are automatically going to be pro Hamas or anti Israel. It seems a little bit unbelievable to me, because it's like the assumption is that if you're of the Muslim faith, you're almost 100% sure going to be pro, I guess, anti-Israel. And that shouldn't be, it shouldn't be the assumption, it seems to me. I don't know. Maybe it is.
Well, it's interesting. There's a couple of Labor front bench ministers that their seat, and it was spoken about that their seat was going to be in jeopardy of them losing their seats, and they've been fabulous. Well, I'd say they've been long-term ministers for the Labor government. But what they were actually Muslim people, that they actually started their own Muslim party here in Australia, and they pitched up their own Muslims against Australian politicians, and they got a fair chunk of votes within this electorate. But in saying that, I would have to also think that there were probably Muslim people that really liked, Chris Bowen and Tony Burke, and voted for them. So even though that there is a large majority of just under 1 million Muslims here in Australia, I don't think categorizing them all in the one bucket is fair, because I think there'd be a lot of people who love this country as well and just have appreciated the freedom and love this country. But there are a lot of people, and I'd say a fair chunk, that they're the ones that are the agitators. They're up there leading the protests. They're chanting the slogans. They've brought in, the Islamic, the flag from the Lebanon, the green and the gold flag, the Hezbollah flag, and they've brought in symbols of terrorism, symbols of Hamas that have just been there in broad daylight. And to me, that is not okay. And for me as an Australian, as an Aboriginal Australian who loves this country, and I will say this because you mentioned it before about the real Australians, because there are white Australians who say this is our country too. No, we're not saying that you don't have. Yes, our soldiers fought for this country for the freedoms of everyone. Let's not forget that. But I had my DNA test 4 years ago during COVID, because we all go crazy a bit, right? During COVID. And my DNA test, so not only am I Aboriginal, but I've got Scottish blood, Irish blood, Filipino blood, Norwegian, and Germanic European, whatever that means. But the Scottish, the Irish, the Germanic European, the Filipino blood, it goes to that country where the DNA comes from. The Aboriginal blood comes from this country, this continent. Aboriginal people do not come from anywhere else. We come from this country. And so I guess where I'm sort of going with that, there's people that have left their country to come to Australia to make it a better life for themselves and their children. But there's been, like, for my husband, who's, fifth, sixth generation white Australian. They've been here this long. So is he an Australian? Absolutely, he is. But I feel that for the betterment of this country, we need strong leadership to put Australian democracy values first and foremost, and to remind people who come to this country, to remind them that they're here because of the blood of my ancestors who were massacred to make way for the impact of colonization. And then we had our soldiers, which the Jews fought for Australia, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people fought for this country. There's been the blood of our soldiers who have fought for the freedoms. Everyone who comes here, and I'm talking about people whether they've come from the Middle East or wherever, need to be reminded whose land this is and how they've gotten the freedoms
And
that they
also,
have.
I want to say that, and we hear, like, even in the US and other Western countries, that people are running away from failed states because it's not good for them. They're either persecuted, poor, they come to make a better life for themselves. And a lot of them, sorryly, bring the the attitudes and cultures of those failed states into the western states. And so the whole point is you're running away from a certain place because it's political culture, it's religious culture, it's is bad, it doesn't work there. You should be not bringing at least the bad parts of it into the new place you're trying to flee to. That's just my feeling. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that it's unsustainable.
Mm, no, you are right, and that's why for me I was so happy when the Greens leader Adam Bant has gone, because he said he wouldn't stand in front of the Australian flag. He had members of his own parliament wearing kafirs into the Australian Parliament. The defacing of the war memorials here with Free Gaza, and bringing the Middle East conflict and defacing the war memorials. And when asked, does he condemn this? He refused to say anything. When one of his own senators was asked about it, he said, well, when people protest, that's free speech, that's a way of getting a message. So they would have to look at graffiti as free speech also. And I'm like, it is absolutely insane that these young people, or people who have no clue of history, once again, and all these serial anarchy people are just protesting for the sake of protesting. And I will say this, I don't know if you were aware, it was only within months after October 7 that there was a 400-page document that was put out to various people who wanted it on how to become a pro-Palestinian activist.
They need a book to tell
The
them how to do it.
chants, the hashtags, what to say, what to do. Correct. They needed a booklet, how to write to your fellow politician, all this, how to get algorithms and all of it. It was just crazy. And I just think, what is this world coming? Like, I'm sitting here in my house, and the only thing I can hear is the crickets, sometimes an aircraft going off, the birds. It's freedom. I live near the water. If there's fish, and it makes me sad what Israel has to deal with, fighting 7 wars all at once. And it's just like, well, where are the friends of Israel? Where are her allies?
Nova, one more thing I
And
wanted to ask you
that
also about
really does
is
break my
you were
heart.
here
It
in
really
Israel.
does.
You spoke about the amazing experiences. So you went obviously to all the religious sites, but also, I assume, to the Gaza envelope where the massacres took place. It's pretty unbelievable until you're there to realize just how shocking what happened was. And I also hear that you're coming soon again. So I'd love to meet up when you come. And you will be honored here by a number of places. So we'll keep that for people to hear about it as it happens. So I also want to talk about the you're a sports person. That's how you started off. You're a gold medalist. And I've been seeing a lot. We used to have only the Iranians and maybe the Saudis in, let's say, judo matches or on the Olympics, where the Israeli player comes up and he has to play the Saudi or the Iranian, and they refuse to play. And so the Israeli wins in a technical win, and the other player forfeits. And I used to think, oh, great, the Israeli won without even playing. But now it's becoming more and more in different sports all over the world. Even Western players, athletes, are not, because they refuse to recognize the Israeli legitimacy to even compete. What do you think when you see these things?
I'm really, really disappointed and saddened by this, because for me, growing up, sports was a foundation for equality. It was the equalizer. It allowed me as a black woman to go live my dreams, to run free or play hockey and be treated with human dignity and equality and by the same rules. So I I'm really saddened by that, and I don't know if you saw, I resigned from the Australian Republican movement because my co-chair was Craig Foster, who was very pro-Palestinian. Well, yeah, you can read about that. How I resigned because I couldn't, where he was going with his point. He actually wanted Israel soccer team banned from the International Soccer Federation, and I said no, this is just an outrageous claim because it was all to do with the international, what is it, the court of who were ICJ. So he'd made claims there which was incorrect in what he was saying, and so that's why he wanted the Israeli football team to be, you know, banned, if you like. So in all of that, it never happened. Thank goodness, and I wrote about it. You know, I met an Israeli fencer, Yuval Freilich, Frelich. So he was an Israeli fencer, and he won the Olympic trials in Qatar in February of last year. And he was telling me that they wouldn't allow him to raise the Israeli flag, but could have his song. And even when he went to the Olympics, he was saying how much protection and security the Israeli team had to have and all of that. And then when Yuval came out to Australia, we did a number of school visits together. So even speaking to him firsthand and knowing that my Olympic experience was incredible compared to his Olympic experience, and telling me all the stories. And I remember the Israeli when they won the gold medal in, was it in the yachting that they and the Israeli flag was in, or tangled up in the flagpole, and I was like thinking, you can't tell me that that wasn't a deliberate sabotage act. I don't know, that's just me, but I'm upset by that. You know, when you think about why sports, the Olympic motto is faster, higher, stronger, it was made to set aside, you don't bring religion, you don't bring any politics in. It's man versus man, woman versus woman, and it's everyone has the ability to be able to go out. And yeah, I'm actually excited when I come back to Israel to be spending some time in the high performance area speaking to young Israeli athletes coming through. So yeah, it does make me sad. You know, I suffered racism in my sporting career, but not to the extent that of the type of discrimination. You know, when you look at anti-Semitism, that's the oldest form of racism on the planet.
Nova, it really
4,000
is a pleasure
years.
talking to you. I have to
4,000
say just
years.
one
It's unbelievable.
just in that context, there's the Eurovision Song Contest. And this year the Israeli contestant singer is a woman who was in October
Mm-hmm.
7th, and she hid in one of the safe rooms under, if I remember correctly, bodies that were being shot at, and she basically played dead and was in the pool of blood, and that's how she was able to be saved. And
Wow.
this woman is going to the contest, and 70 contestants and former contestants signed a letter demanding that she be banned from the contest because she's Israeli. And it's like, it's so unbelievable, and it goes to what everything you just said. So I think it's corrosive also for the legitimacy of the contest itself, or because if you remember last year, the Israeli contestant got 0 points from the judges, and then got into
That's
third place because of people
It,
voting
it,
online and on the phones and everything. So there's a silent majority. Yeah, yeah.
I know. Yes, there is. And
Mm.
Eden Golan, is it Eden Golan? Yeah, I met her last year. She came out to Australia and I
Yeah.
cried. I watched her performance live and it was just mind-boggling. And what I loved about her is when she just strutted the flag, the stage with the Israeli flag, and the performance and the way she graced,
Hmm.
she honored her
Yeah.
people, she honored her country, and she did a big stuff you to the world. I might be a tiny force, but we know the Israeli women and the young women in your IDF is just unbelievable. I'm just in awe of how you not only have
Yeah.
to continue your connection to your land, but you have to continue to fight for your land and your freedoms. But this young girl who's now going in, what she's been able to do to get to where she has, this is, I hope, whatever, if they try to ban her, I hope, you know what's the
Yeah.
word, what that the truth prevails and
And
honesty
also
prevails
Eden,
and
yeah.
humanity
Also
prevails
Eden, by the way,
because she
had to
deserves
take
to be
out
there.
some of the lines in
And
her
that
song
for
at the
me is,
contest
yeah.
because it was remembering people who passed away on October 7th, and they said it was political. It's very weird that you're remembering fallen friends, and you can't even say that at these international organizations. But yeah, it's very depressing a lot of times, but then, like you said, there's a
Wow.
silent majority that votes for you and you realize that you're not alone. And so on that point, it's very, very optimistic. So Nova, I want to say that how
Yes.
much I enjoyed hearing you and talking to you and seeing you when you come here. So thank you so much for being with us today.